Chapter 12, Learners with Exceptionalities. Organizing questions for this chapter are, who are learners with exceptionalities, or ESE as we like to refer to it, exceptional student education? So what is special education? What's this new thing called response to intervention? What is inclusion? What are the effects, or what are some effective strategies for students with disabilities in general ed classrooms? Learners with exceptionalities are students who have special education needs in relation to societal or school norms. An inability to perform appropriate academic tasks for any reason inherent in the learner makes them an exceptional learner, or the learner exceptional. A handicap is a condition or barrier imposed by the environment or on the self. A disability is a functional limitation that interferes with a person's mental, physical, or sensory abilities. Now, a lot of times there's a question on the test that you guys always get wrong. What's the difference between a handicap and a disability? If you happen to wear eyeglasses, you have a disability, but because you have visual impairment. However, because of your glasses, you don't necessarily have a handicap, because with some kind of supportive device, you are no longer have a disability. So a disability limits your mental, physical, or sensory abilities, where a handicap is usually imposed on you by the environment. You are not handicapped because you have readily access to eyeglasses or to corrective vision. However, if you lived in a third world country and you didn't have access to, an eye doctor or glasses or something like that, then your disability would also be a handicap because it's imposed on by the environment or by the self. A lot of times people with physical disabilities don't really have a handicap that often. They might be in a wheelchair or something like that, but they get around just fine. But they can usually develop a handicap when places aren't handicap accessible. People first language. Instead of saying, hey, look at that LD kid or look at that EH kid, we did that for quite a while. Our language and vocabulary and terminology, we want to refer to the person first and then the disability. You don't want to make the disability more important than the person. So there's two pretty much basic principles when you talk about this. Put the people first. Frankie is a student with a learning disability, not a learning disabled student. He is a student first, and the fact that he has a learning disability should be secondary. The second principle is to avoid making the person equal to the disability. Each person may have a characteristic, and a disability is just one of them. If you've ever watched the movie My Left Foot, it's a great film. If you haven't, you should watch it. It's good. It's about a guy who has physical disabilities. He has cerebral palsy. And he ends up becoming this amazing painter and writer and artist. But he's a jerk. I mean, if you just watch the movie, he's just such a jerk. So it always makes me laugh because a lot of times people equate the disability with certain types of stereotypes. He's going to be such a nice guy. Or as my student that's in a wheelchair, she always says that people talk really, really loud to her. And she said, and I always say to him, I'm not deaf. I'm just in a wheelchair. So that people kind of equate the disability and their stereotypes about that disability with that person. So you have to treat each person first as a person like you would be meeting any person and not have any preconceived notions. There are a lot of different types of exceptionalities and the number served. When we were talking a minute ago, in special education, when we're talking about education, the law that goes along with special education is called IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. But the federal government, under the Civil Rights Act, has something called the ADA, American Disabilities Act. And you can have both of those. I'm going to talk about them both in a little bit in a few minutes. But the ADA is a much looser definition of a disability. As IDEA, it's very specific to certain disabilities and then the educational implications. So some exceptionalities, such as loss of vision and hearing, are relatively easy to define and measure. If a person can't hear, it's pretty obvious. Well, not necessarily pretty obvious because you could have varying degrees of deafness. But You can have some tests and you're going to be able to figure that out. If a person's missing a limb, you know they're missing a limb. Other disabilities, such as maybe mild mental retardation or intellectual disabilities, a learning disability, even on this autism spectrum, sometimes you will know that a child's on the autism spectrum, especially if they're on the farther end, closer to the true autistic behavior, or if they're on the more milder side where they maybe are more like what we used to call Asperger's syndrome. Those are harder to determine. Things like emotional disturbance, they're real hard to define. And their definitions have definitely evolved over time. But if we look at figure 2.1, which we'll look at in just a second, it shows all the percentage of children from ages 3 to 21 who are receiving services in special education in 2009, 2010, but it hasn't changed really that much. So all disabilities, 13.1% of the population in schools have some sort of disability. So if you have a class of 20, you're going to have a little over 1.5. Typically right now in most of the schools I see, if you have a class of 20, you usually have 2. So it's ranging between 10 and 20%, which is about 13.1%. Sometimes if you have 2 or 3, it's because they think you're good at working with kids like that, so they'll put extra kids in there because you get a little extra services too. Of that 13.1, 4.9% of them are labeled with having a learning disability. 2.9 are speech and language. Now, when I was going to school, speech and language was the highest. Learning disabilities, which we used to call minimal brain dysfunction at one time, and then not specific learning disabilities, just learning disabilities, it was less. It was the second highest, but it was less. Intellectual disabilities is 0.9% of that population. Hearing impairment is 0.2. Orthopedic impairment, which is like physical disabilities, is 0.1. Otherwise health impaired is 1.4. Now you think, wow, 1.4, that's the third largest. That's because ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, and ADD fall under otherwise health impaired unless they also have a learning disability or an emotional disorder or disturbance along with it. Visual impairments is 0.1. Multiple disabilities is 0.3. Autism is 0.8. So it goes along pretty much right there with emotional disturbance and intellectual disabilities. Traumatic brain injury is 0.1, and then developmentally delayed, which that usually we use the term developmentally delayed with preschool kids, and they will either go into like the autism or otherwise health impaired category, because we don't want to really label them when they're that young. This second chart right here is actually 2009 to 2010 percentage of children receiving special ed services that goes along with that. So when we look at all the kids that are receiving special ed services, 37.5% of them have a learning disability, 21.8 have speech and language, still the biggest one. Otherwise health impaired is 10.6 if you look at that. Which is pretty high because I told you before it's ADHD. Intellectual disabilities, 7.1, emotional disturbance, 6.3, and then autism, 5.8. And then developmentally delayed, 5.7. Like I said, developmentally delayed typically is going to be your preschool, kindergarten age children. So they're going to end up in one of those other categories after they've been in school for a little while. But as a general ed teacher, you can help students who have intellectual disabilities. We're going to look at that first. Intellectual disabilities to acquire adaptive behavior. In order for you to have an intellectual disability, I'm going to draw a little. This is your normal distribution, which was horribly drawn. And in order to have an intellectual disability, the average IQ is 100. 1 standard deviation and 2 standard deviations below the mean, this should be a little bit farther over, is 1 standard deviation below the mean, it's a 15-point range, is 85, and 2 standard deviations below the mean is 70. And when we get to the next couple chapters, you're actually going to see like 98% of the population, 98, I think it is 0.2 or 0.6, percent of the population falls within 2 standard deviations either above or below the mean. So if you have an IQ below 70 or 70 or below, you are 2 standard deviations below the mean. And what we found though was sometimes kids didn't score well on IQ tests just because of cultural reasons and stuff like that. Like the test wasn't very good. I think I told you guys already the story about the kid who didn't know when we were talking about Head Start, that didn't know where milk came from. He didn't do real well on his IQ test because culturally he was not familiar with a lot of the things that were on the test. So what they did with intellectual disabilities is you have to have an IQ of 70 or below. Some districts will take 75 or below, but you also have to have something called a low adaptive behavior. And adaptive behavior are things like bathing, interpersonal skills, money, things like that go along with that. So that's why they say who have intellectual disabilities to acquire adaptive behavior. So one of the things you have to work on when we're doing that is coping with the demands of school. A lot of times the kids with the lower IQs, they get kind of stuck between the crack. They may have high adaptive behavior, but they still have a low IQ, so they struggle with keeping the pace of the classroom. Developing interpersonal relationships. I had a young girl who was low IQ. She was had a intellectual disability. I would say, I don't know if her IQ was 70 or below, but it was lower. And other kids they were making fun of her and stuff, and I would just get on those other girls so bad. But when I talked to her, like, she would say, but they're my friends, because she didn't really understand that they were actually making fun of her. They would make her jump up on the table and pretend like she was flirting with the boys. They would have her do all kinds of these crazy things. And she thought they were trying to be her friend, when actually they were just making fun of her. And developing language skills is a big one that goes along with that. Typically, people with intellectual disabilities tend to have poor vocabulary. Their language skills aren't very well developed. Social emotional development goes along with that, where they tend to be much more immature for their age. So we want to try and get them to age appropriate peer relationships. Somebody who with an intellectual disability below 70 might be actually functioning, might be like 14 or 15 and functioning on the mental capacity of about a 5-year-old. And then you also have to worry about personal care, taking care of oneself. Because if you've got a 14-year-old kid who has the body of a 14-year-old, with all the hormones and the smells and everything that go along with it, but they have the mental ability of a 5-year-old, then they don't necessarily know that they have to bathe all the time and put on deodorant and all that stuff that goes along with it. And it's not a bad thing to implicitly teach that. We used to teach, go brush your teeth every morning. Put on deodorant. When we talk about kids with intellectual disabilities or students with intellectual disabilities, we used to use the terms mild, moderate, and severe, or educable, educable, trainable, educable, and educable. Severe and profound, trainable, and educable. That was the 3 levels. Severe and profound typically were kids with IQs below 55. They were like 3 standard deviations below the mean. And they usually didn't even communicate very well. They had limited ability to talk and stuff like that. They might use a communication board for yes and no and stuff like that, but they usually had pretty severe speech and language issues. They may not, working on toilet training, and that was almost impossible. I've even worked with some kids where they would just have to respond to a flashing light. Those were called severe and profound children. Now, trainable kids were kids that you could train to do things. It sounds terrible to say. That's why we don't use that really anymore. But you could, potty train them possibly, teach them to feed themselves, basic communication skills of what they want and what they don't want, and what they like and what they don't like. Those were kids that were considered trainable. Educable children were kids that were about 1.5 standard deviations below the mean, and they were able to read, do some basic math, stuff like that goes along with it. And they usually could, become pretty self-sufficient. Now we actually talk about it in types of support. When you look at table 12.1 on page 305, you're looking at the different types of support. Intermittent is usually a pretty high functioning person with intellectual disabilities because the support is only on an as-needed basis. Characterized by episodic nature, person not always needing the support, or short-term support. My brother he has actually a really high IQ, and he has autism, and he also has cerebral palsy, and he's deaf and he's mute. But when I talk to him, the reason I talk about it, he has intermittent support right now. In that, like when he first started working at Taco Bell, he used to work at Taco Bell. Like when we first they taught him how to make tacos. He actually would make the whole taco and then he'd eat it. So we had this job coach that would go in and kind of walk him through everything that he had to learn, and then they would slowly phase themselves out. Limited, excuse me, Limited is an intensity of support characterized by consistency over time. Time limited, but not of an intermittent nature. Might require fewer staff members and cost less than more intense levels of support. So it's not like intermittent where you're only going in to just do one or two things. My brother, actually right now, he's not working as much, but at home, in his home life, he has limited. Like he has staff members. He lives in a 2-person condo. But they drive him to work, but they're there all the time. They make sure that his medications, he's got COPD really bad, and he's on 2 different types of asthma medications and such. And he has to have like inhalers and treatments 1, 2, 3 times, at least 3 times a day. So they do this over time. They make sure that they go grocery shopping. They do all that kind of stuff. But when he was on his job, like when he was at his job coaching, through his supported work environment, he had intermittent help. But at home, he has more limited help because he can do a lot of stuff on his own. He cleans his own apartment, he does his own laundry, he cooks his own food, he does all that kind of stuff. But somebody has to check on, make sure he keeps his medicines going. They have to drive him to the grocery store. They have to do all that kind of stuff. Extensive support characterized by regular involvement daily in the at least some environment, such as work or home, and not time limited. Long-term support, long-term home living support. So he has limited support. I mean, I would say he has extensive support because somebody stays there 24 hours a day. But there was a time, right now they do, but there was a time before his medicine increased where they had staff that would float between, there's like 4 apartments where they live in this condominium place, and the staff would float between them. So he kind of fluctuates between limited and extensive. Pervasive support characterized by their constant high intensity provided across all environments, potentially life-sustaining nature. Pervasive supports typically involves more staff members and intrusive than do extensive and time limited. So when we have pervasive support, a lot of people have to be fed. They may be medically fragile, so they might have to have trachs changed and all that kind of stuff that goes along with it. Typically, kids that are need intermittent support are served in regular ed classrooms, or maybe some self-contained pull-out programs. Limited to extensive, they're usually in a self-contained program, and a pervasive, a lot of times they're more in a hospital homebound type of environment. The other disability that we're going to talk about that they cover in your book is, first we had intellectual disabilities, and these are those ones that are hard to, put your finger on. Then we have learning disabilities. It's a general term for a diverse group of disorders characteristic by acquisition and a use of listening. So they have difficulties in listening, speaking, reading, writing, reasoning, and computing. They also have, writing. That would be dysgraphia. I was going to say, so learning disabilities is kind of a real catch-all thing in the sense that you have an average IQ. That's the difference. When you have a learning disability, you have to have an average IQ. So you have an average IQ, but yet, even though, according to your intelligence quotient, you should be able to do all these things and perform them with relative ease, you still have problems with maybe speaking, expressive language, reading and writing, receptive language, listening, receptive language, reasoning, maybe not being able to reason everything out, or mathematical or problems with math, which would be computational errors. These disorders stem from an individual and may occur across a lifespan. So you don't get rid of a learning disability. Typically, you just learn to cope with the symptoms of a learning disability. So when we look at learning disabilities, some general concepts, if you're going to be an effective teacher, and there's a whole class on this, so don't think you have to learn it all right now, is we try to emphasize prevention. Many of learning deficits can be caused by children. To be categorized as having a learning disability can be prevented. We have way too many kids in learning disabilities. And one of the reasons they think that they're in there is because they didn't have proper instruction at one time. So many students with learning disabilities lack good strategies for studying, test taking, and stuff like that. So they just don't know how to study. They don't know effective reading strategies. So if we can actually teach them, it really helps out. Giving frequent feedback to kids with learning disabilities as well is important, because they tend to a lot of kids with learning disabilities tend to be on the lower end of the spectrum with memory skills. So when you have that, they seem less likely than other students to be able to work productively for long periods of time with little or no feedback. They need you to be reminding them they're doing a good job. Because they have that lower ability to remember large sums of information, chunking their work a lot of times helps as well. You know, you give them one chunk and then they come back and you tell them they did a great job, then you give them another chunk of work and then you tell them, you know, good job, and then you give them another chunk of work. When we talk about, I put the wrong thing in there, sorry. When we also talk about kids with learning disabilities, remember this is the highest one that we have. Use teaching strategies that engage students actively in lessons. It goes back to chapter 11 about engaging kids. A lot of hands-on, a lot of visual and auditory that goes along with it. A lot of kids with learning disabilities are kinesthetic. They like to touch things and be hands-on. We want to make sure that we use effective classroom management strategies, because out of the frustration they can get out of hand. And then we want to coordinate supplementary services with classroom instruction. That means that you're going to push in or you're going to pull out kids. So we're going to either put them in some kind of maybe tutorial. It could be even a computer-based tutorial. They're going to have resource teachers. You could pull out some one-on-one teaching. And then we have resource teachers that either come in or that the kids will go to get extra services. One of the next higher groups that we talk about, and they usually go hand in hand with learning disabilities, is ADHD, or attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. Some of you may have been diagnosed with this. I was. You have difficulties maintaining attention because of limited ability to concentrate. And actually, most researchers would say that's not actually true, is that it's not that you can't focus on one thing, it's that you focus on everything. And so they have a harder time picking out relevant information. ADHD includes impulsive actions, attention deficits, and sometimes hyperactive behavior. You can be ADD, attention deficit disorder, and not have the H, which is hyperactivity. These characteristics differentiate students with ADHD from students with learning disabilities who have attention deficits for other unknown reasons. So one of the things that we know, the difference really between a learning disabled child and an ADHD child is ADHD children typically will have trouble with school, but it's not because they don't understand it, like a learning disabled child may have problems with. It's not because they may have dyslexia where they see letters backwards. It's not any of those reasons that they are. It's more for the being able to attend to the task or finish a task, where kids with learning disabilities may not be able to do it, but they can attend to it. Children with ADHD often are impulsive, inattentive, and hard to sit still. This is one of the reasons why we strongly suggest that you build in those brain breaks where you have people get up and move around. There are medications for ADHD, things like Adderall, Ritalin, and stuff like that. And a lot of people will say that the child is more manageable and they have improved academic performance. The only bad part about those drugs is that I do have ADHD, so it would help, but if somebody who didn't have ADHD were to take Adderall, they too would also have improved academic performance. It's just we're not really sure of the long-term effects of what goes along with that. Because the medications can have some side effects such as insomnia, weight loss, blood pressure changes, and it really shouldn't be prescribed unless you've tried other strategies to get kids to focus, like, increasing their, breaking it up with brain breaks, breaking up, your task into smaller chunks and then giving them praise after each chunk. Letting kids, have some choice in what they do and how they exhibit or represent what they're doing for their work. One of the third higher categories of this too is Speech and language impairments. About 1 in every 30 to 40 children have a communication disorder serious enough to warrant speech therapy or some other kind of special ed services. Although the terms speech and language are often used interchangeably, they're not the same. Language is the communication of ideas using symbols, including written language, sign language, and gestures. So it's not just spoken language, it can be any one of those. There are many kinds of speech disorders. The most common are articulation. So speech is the actual production of sound. So there are speech disorders, which could be articulation, when kids say things like faster, where they're not actually saying that faster, where they kind of get that the airy sound to it. It could also be worms when they do that, but we have to watch because it can't be dialectical. Like it can't be that you just sit on the coib and watch the boy deep the boy worms. It can't be that you're just from Boston and that's the way you talk. It could be a phonological disorder where kids have trouble saying specific letter sounds or letter blends. A lot of little kids will say they have the th sound like Kathy. They'll have a hard time saying the th in Kathy. They'll say Kathy because it's easier to say that ones. Omissions is another one where they'll either drop off the end of a word or some kids will drop off the beginning of a word. Distortions is where they'll kind of mix up words and distort where the sounds are supposed to come out. And then sometimes kids substitute sounds, like they'll substitute the R for the L sound. Another popular special education category is children with emotional and behavioral disorders. This is the one I pretty much taught most of my career. Students with EBD have been defined as those with educational performance is adversely affected over a long period of time and to a marked degree by any of the following conditions. Now, this is important because it can't just happen in one class period. It has to happen over all of the classes, and it has to have been something that's been going on for a while. Sometimes kids will start acting up. Maybe a parent died or somebody got a divorce or something like that, and they might have some behavior problems. So it has to be over a marked period of time. Or a long period of time in a marked degree, which means it has to be like 2 standard deviations above the norm of whatever their peers are like. An inability to learn that cannot be explained by intellectual, sensory, or health factors. So they can't have it. They're not supposed to have any of those other ones. They can't be like have a vision problem or a hearing problem. It can't be that they have developmental disability or intellectual developmental disability. It can't be that. They have to have a normal IQ. They have to have all their senses checked to make sure they've got all their good senses. And then they also have to rule out any kind of health factors. Like sometimes kids who have thyroid problems sometimes will develop an emotional disturbance such as depression and stuff like that. An inability to build and maintain satisfactory interpersonal relationship with peers and teachers. So they pretty much don't know how to get along with other people. Inappropriate types of behaviors or feelings under normal circumstances. I've had a kid that would just burst out crying for absolutely no reason whatsoever. A pervasive mood of unhappiness or depression, and a tendency to develop physical symptoms such as pain or fears associated with personal or school problems. Kids who are school phobic and they start to stay home all the time can sometimes, like they'll physically get ill from going to school and the stress of school. Autism disorder, since 1990, autism has become a formal category in this disability. We used to say like Asperger's syndrome and autism and some of other less common types of autism. But what we've actually found through this time is that now we call it the autism spectrum, or ASD, autism spectrum disorder. And the spectrum is pretty wide. But it typically shows that the child has had some kind of ASD or autistic-like behavior before the age of 3. And it has a definite adverse effect on performance. Children with autism are typically extremely withdrawn and have such severe difficulties with language that they may be entirely mute. Communication, or the inability to communicate or have effective communication, is pretty high. Usually kids, a lot of times with autism, will do things like echolalia, which means that they repeat what you do. They kind of like are parroting. And they often engage in self-stimulation activities such as rocking, twirling objects, flapping their hands. But sometimes they have normal or even outstanding abilities in certain areas. But that's more on the Asperger side of the syndrome, where they may be really good in math and stuff like that. Temple Grandin, there's a movie called Temple Grandin. It's a great movie. She has autism and was mute up until about age 8, I think it is. But she has this ability to think in pictures, and she sees everything in pictures. But if you meet her, you will know that she's on the spectrum. This is probably the most this is the disability that has been hitting the schools the hardest lately. I have principals calling all the time, and they want workshops done on how to deal with kids on the autism spectrum. The good thing is we must be doing a lot of right things, because we're also seeing a lot of kids on the autism spectrum now here at colleges, and before they would never make it that far. The term autism spectrum disorder is that what we're using now. It includes the mild form of Asperger's all the way up to autism. Children with Asperger's syndrome may be able to function in society, and they can be really successful in school, but they still have problems with social relationships. Typically, they don't know how to read social signals, and they pretty much say what's on their mind. I had a young man that I work with that would say stuff like, he would say like, well, I would like to have a girlfriend right now, because I think this is the time that it is appropriate for you to have a girlfriend. I go, yep, it is. This is about the time when you have girlfriends. Did you have a boyfriend at this time in your age? I'm like, yep, I did. Were you sexually involved with him at that time? And I'm thinking, I go, that's one of those questions that are really personal that you shouldn't be asking someone. Oh, okay. He wasn't offended that you just kind of cut him off and say, that's not an appropriate thing to be talking about right now. Or, I'm not really comfortable talking about that right now. And they won't really take offense. They're like, oh, okay. Dr. Sachs, Leonard Sachs, who wrote Why Gender Matters, a really, really brilliant guy, and someone I work with, he's definitely on the spectrum somewhere. You can't really joke with him. He never gets jokes. He never gets that nuance of language. And so he'd say, I need you to do X, Y, and Z. And I go, I don't know, Leonard, that's a lot. X, Y, and Z is a lot. And he'd go, oh, I'm so sorry, Kathy. I thought you would have been able to handle that. I go, Leonard, I was just joking. I can definitely handle it. It's no big deal. Oh, that was a joke. Funny. Funny. He can tell jokes to large groups of people, but he doesn't really get jokes. But he's working on it. A lot of times they'll avoid eye contact. They kind of look next to you or above you or below you. They're always avoiding eye contact. They don't make that direct eye contact. And that's when I said they misinterpret social cues all the time. And a lot of times they'll have some weird behaviors. They have a self-stimulating behaviors. And one of the kids that I work with was always sticking his fingers up his nose, which is pretty gross. And so the teacher was having him wash his hands every day. Every single time he stuck his fingers up his nose, he had to go wash his hands. Well, it was not decreasing the behavior at all. So what we actually figured out was, he wasn't real verbal, that he liked that squishy feeling that's up your nose. So we got him one of those really gross squishy balls, that the little gooey stuff is inside of it. He completely stopped squishing his nose. Stick his finger up his nose. So sometimes you want to replace the behavior that's inconsistent with, that makes him stand out, makes him look funny, with a behavior that's more socially acceptable. Other kids that we have is kids with sensory, physical, and health impairment. Sensory impairment is like being able to see, being able to hear. So children who are deaf, children who are hard of hearing, children who are blind or with severe visual disorders. Physical disorders include things like cerebral palsy, spina bifida, spinal cord injury, muscular dystrophy. By the way, spina bifida, if you take a prenatal vitamin or have high levels of folic acid in your body prior to pregnancy, it reduces the risk of having spina bifida by 80%. Having a child with spina bifida by 80%. Spinal cord injury is another one that we talk a lot about too. That's another one that you have to watch out for, because it's not something that you're definitely born with. It's usually something that you develop along the way. Health disorders is another one that they talk about in the book. Examples, AIDS, acquired immune deficiency syndrome. One of the things I do have to tell you about AIDS is you may have a child with AIDS in your classroom and not know it, because under law and the HIPAA law, they're not required to tell you. So you have to treat every child in your classroom as though they do have AIDS, because you don't want to have like a cut on your finger, like a paper cut on your finger, and then have some kid bleeding all over you. So you would glove up. If a kid's bleeding, you glove up. You wipe everything down with bleach, because that's what you do. Seizure disorders, which is like epilepsy, is another one that is common within classrooms. Diabetes, cystic fibrosis. We had a young woman here in town that went to Stetson that we had with cystic fibrosis. Unfortunately, she's passed since then. She only lived to be 25. It's a pretty serious disease. Sickle cell anemia, which tends to affect mostly African Americans. And bodily damage from chemical addiction. Sometimes we have kids that, come into our classrooms with from drug overdoses. Child abuse, kids who have been through child abuse, and some kinds of attempted suicide. My daughter fell under health disorders when she had the tumor in her back. She had a aneurysmal bone cyst that blew out the bone in her sacrum. And the cyst itself was like a tumor, and it grew around the nerves that were coming out of the lower part of her spine, and she was paralyzed in her 10th grade year for about 3 months. So she had to take her classes online at home, and she had a little bit of extra time to do that because she didn't get her surgery. She wasn't able to have her surgery until April, and it was first diagnosed in January. So from January to April, she was in this extreme pain, and she was on morphine, and she was on hydrocodone, and she was pretty much high the whole time. But she took her classes online for those classes, and then when she was able to go to school, she went just for 2 classes that they didn't have online, which was art and chemistry, because she didn't want to drop out of her international baccalaureate program. So she would try to go to school for 2 hours in the morning, but she was pretty drugged up. But we had an IEP for her, and it fell under otherwise health impaired. Giftedness does not fall under IDEA, and not every state offers programs for giftedness, but it was once defined almost entirely in terms of just having a superior IQ. You had to have an IQ. I draw that normal distribution before. And this is that's horrible normal distribution. This is exactly the opposite of mental retardation, in the sense that you are 2 standard deviations above the mean in your IQ, which means that you are pretty much the kids with the IQs over 130 are like, what is it, 1.7 or 2.2% of the population. I don't remember if it's 97.8. We'll look at it next chapter. Anyway, however, some groups are under-identified as gifted. We don't have enough. For some reason, we have too many Asian kids that are identified as gifted, and not enough Hispanic and African American. Some people argued in the 90s and 2000 about this thing called the bell curve theory, that they just were not intellectually superior enough. We know that's just a bunch of hoo-ha. Really what it is any group that is suppressed. Like if you went to Ireland and you were to measure the IQ, I don't remember if it's the Protestants or Catholics. I don't remember which one's the repressed group. But whatever one's the repressed group has a lower IQ than the Catholics do. I think it's the Catholics are repressed, so the Protestants have a higher IQ. But anyway, whichever one's repressed. Any country that has repression of one group over another tends to have a lower IQ. So that means that there are cultural effects that underline it. So kids of color tend to be not identified as gifted quite as often as children that aren't. We also have to look at some of the socioeconomic factors that go along with it. Kids of middle and upper class tend to be identified higher than kids with lower class. And approximately 3 to 5% of the students are also considered gifted and talented. And it goes back to that chapter when we talked about Howard Gardner, and that there are multiple intelligences, because some kids could be gifted in bodily kinesthetic, really good in sports, but yet they don't excel in the classroom.